I was icing a tray of cinnamon buns when my whole life cracked open. It was a Tuesday morning in late January, the kind of cold that makes the windows of the bakery fog up before 6 a.m. I'd been up since 4, same as always, my hands raw from the mixer. Flour dusted into the creases of my knuckles. Outside, Bloor Street was still dark, salt crunching under the boots of the first commuters. My phone was sitting on the flour sack beside the register, and when it buzzed I almost didn't hear it over the mixer. Unknown number. Toronto area code, but not one I recognized. I wiped my hands on my apron and picked it up anyway, mostly out of habit. A woman's voice, very measured, the kind of voice trained to deliver bad news without letting it shake. She asked if she was speaking with Junebug Ashworth. Nobody called me that anymore, not since my grandfather used to say it, drawing the syllables out like he was teasing me. I told her yes. She told me she was calling from a law office in Kingston. She told me there had been a fire at a property on Wolf Island. She told me my grandparents, Walter and Noreen Ashworth, hadn't made it out. I remember looking down at the piping bag still in my hand, frosting beginning to harden at the tip, and thinking, very clearly, that I needed to finish this tray before the lunch rush. That's the strange thing nobody tells you about grief. It doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives in pieces, and the first piece that morning was simply, the buns still need icing. Before I tell you what happened after that phone call, you should understand the kind of family I grew up in, because on paper, we looked like the kind of family people envy. I was raised in Oakville, in a house with a circular driveway and a ravine lot my parents loved to mention at dinner parties. My father, Roland, ran a commercial insurance brokerage downtown, and wore his Rolex the way other men wear wedding rings. Like it was load-bearing. My mother, Celestine, sat on 2 charity boards and 1 condo association, and treated all 3 with the same brittle, performative seriousness. I have an older brother, Thatcher, 3 years up, golden, in every way a Canadian private school produces golden children. Captain of the rowing team, Dean's List at Western, the kind of laugh that made teachers forgive him things. I was the quiet one. I liked baking in rainstorms and the smell of yeast proofing on a windowsill. At family dinners I mostly listened. My mother used to say I marched to a different beat, which in her vocabulary was not a compliment. The only place I ever felt like a whole person was at my grandparents' house on Wolf Island, a 40-minute ferry ride, off Kingston. Out where the St. Lawrence opens up, wide and gray and endless. My grandfather had built a marine supply business from a single rented dock, Ashworth Marine, fixing outboard motors for fishermen who couldn't afford the marina in town. He left school after grade 9. My grandmother kept the books by hand for 30 years before she'd let him buy a computer, and even then, she didn't trust it. Their house smelled like cedar and coffee and the lake. My grandmother grew rhubarb along the fence line that came back enormous every June whether she fussed over it or not. My grandfather had a workshop full of tools hung on a pegboard, each one outlined in marker so he'd know if it had wandered off. And he'd let me hand him wrenches and explain, very seriously, the difference between a Robertson and a Phillips, like I was 12 and not 26. My father was embarrassed by them. He called the island the outpost. And at every Thanksgiving he'd make some small comment about my grandfather's truck, or my grandmother reusing tinfoil. That wasn't quite cruel enough to call out but was never, ever kind. He conveniently forgot that Ashworth Marine had co-signed the loan on his very first brokerage office. He forgot that when his business nearly folded in 2009, it was my grandparents who quietly wired the money that kept the lights on, and never once mentioned it again. I spent every summer of my childhood on that island. My grandmother taught me to make a proper butter tart, and to darn a sock instead of throwing it out, and to always, always look a person in the eye. My grandfather taught me that a handshake from an honest man was worth more than any lawyer's letter, and that the people doing the hardest, quietest work were usually the ones nobody thought to thank. When I told my parents, at 20, that I wanted to open a bakery instead of finishing my business degree, my mother set down her wineglass very deliberately. "Junebug," she said, "you have options." My father didn't even look up from his phone. "We're not funding a hobby." My grandparents funded it, without a single condition attached. My grandmother mailed me a card the week I signed the lease, her handwriting slanted and certain. "We are so proud of you. The world needs more people who make small things well. You are going to do just fine." I still have that card tucked in the till of the register, behind the float. My parents called maybe once a month, and it was always to mention something Thatcher had closed, some deal, some promotion, or to remind me I needed something appropriate for my cousin's wedding. They never once asked what I was proofing that week. Every Sunday for 11 years, I took the GO train to Kingston and the ferry over to the island for dinner. Rain, snow, ice storms. I missed maybe 4 Sundays in over a decade, and every one of those was because I was sick in bed. The funeral was held at a funeral home in Kingston with too much beige carpet, and it was everything my family always was. Polished, photographed, hollow. My mother wore a hat with a small black veil, which felt theatrical even by her standards. My father gave a eulogy that listed Ashworth Marine's revenue figures like he was pitching a client. Thatcher stood in the receiving line accepting condolences with a grief he had not earned and did not feel. Judging by how quickly he checked his watch, relatives I hadn't seen since I was a teenager filled the pews murmuring about what wonderful people Walter and Noreen had been, which might have meant something if any of them had visited the island, even once in the last 10 years. I stood at the back and I cried, and nobody came to stand beside me. 2 weeks later, we were summoned to a law office on King Street in downtown Kingston, a glass building with a view of the harbor. My father walked in like he'd already redecorated the boardroom in his head. My mother's nails, freshly done, were folded carefully in her lap. Thatcher had driven up from Toronto and spent the whole meeting glancing at the door, like something better might still walk through it. The lawyer's name was Marguerite Okafor, and she had the calm, unbothered voice of someone who had done this exact thing many times before. She read through the preliminary language, and I barely absorbed a word of it. I was looking at a framed photograph on her wall, a freighter passing through the Thousand Islands at dawn, trying not to part out. Then she said it. The entirety of the estate, Ashworth Marine in full, the property on Wolf Island, and all liquid and investment holdings, appraised at $26 million, has been left to a single beneficiary. She looked up. Junebug Marguerite Ashworth is the sole heir. The silence after that was the loudest thing I have ever sat inside of. My father's expression moved through about 4 stages in 5 seconds. Confusion, disbelief, something close to fury. All of it badly disguised as composure. Say that again, he said very quietly, and his voice had the specific control of a man trying not to shout in front of a stranger. Marguerite did not say it again. She slid the document across the desk instead. My mother's composure went first. This is absurd, she said. They were 81 and 79 years old. June was up there every single weekend, filling their heads with whatever she filled their heads with. Marguerite, unbothered, said they had anticipated exactly this question. She turned her laptop around, and there they were, my grandparents on the screen, sitting on the same plaid couch I'd curled up on 1,000 times, my grandfather's hand resting over my grandmother's. They looked smaller than I remembered, a little more tired, but their eyes were sharp and entirely, fully present. My grandfather spoke first. Well, if you're watching this, we've gone and died, and I hope we didn't leave too much of a mess behind. My grandmother elbowed him, smiling despite herself. I picked the caskets, she said, so at least we'll look respectable going out. Even from a screen, even in that moment they made me laugh through tears. We thought long and hard about this, my grandmother said, looking straight into the camera. And we decided legacy was never about the money. It's about who you've been, all along, when you thought no one was keeping score. My grandfather cleared his throat. Roland, Celestine, you're our children, and we love you. But love and trust aren't the same animal, and it took us a long time to understand that. We watched how you spent money, and how you treated the people who couldn't do anything for you, in return. We saw it all. My grandmother's eyes found the lens directly, like she was looking right at me, and we saw June, every Sunday, for 11 years, in every kind of weather. She never once asked us for a thing. She fixed your grandfather's lunch when his hands got bad with the arthritis. She sat with the books with me on the bad nights. She is the one who kept this family's heart beating, so she's the one who gets to keep what we built. The screen went dark. I won't describe everything that happened in that office over the next 10 minutes, except to say it was loud, and it was not brief. My father used a word I'd never once heard him say in front of a stranger. My mother cried in a way that had absolutely nothing to do with grief. Thatcher looked at me with a contempt so clean it almost felt like clarity. That evening, they summoned me to my parents' house, in Oakville. I went, some small foolish part of me still hoping there might be something left to salvage. There wasn't. My father had paperwork drawn up already, a transfer of trusteeship, naming himself and Thatcher as joint administrators. Until things were settled, I would receive what he called a fair monthly allowance. 15% was the actual number. You run a bakery, June, my mother said, like it was a diagnosis rather than a business. You cannot manage a marine company and an estate of this size. This is us protecting you. I looked down at the papers on the glass coffee table. I thought about my grandmother's voice still ringing in my ears. She's the one who kept this family's heart beating. No, I said. It escalated fast. Thatcher slammed a cupboard door hard enough that a wine glass rattled off the shelf. My father told me that if I walked out of that house without signing, I was finished. No Christmas, no calls, no family, full stop. I walked out anyway. I found out within the hour that my father owned the building my bakery operated out of. Had owned it for 6 years through a numbered company, 21847 Wine, Ontario Limited. Something he had never once mentioned. A notice came through by email before midnight. My commercial lease was being terminated, effective in 30 days, the maximum legal notice required, which somehow made the cruelty of it feel even more deliberate. I packed what I could fit into my car that night. My clothes. My grandmother's recipe box. The letters they'd sent me over the years, tied with kitchen string. The quilt she'd made me when I left for culinary school, stitched from scraps of her old house dresses, and my grandfather's flannel shirts, and one small square cut from my brownie uniform. I drove east out of Oakville, onto the 401, toward Kingston, toward the ferry, toward the only place that had ever actually felt like mine. Marguerite Okafor was on the porch of my grandparents' house the next morning before 8. Holding 2 coffees and a paper bag of butter tarts from the bakery in town. She said she'd called all night and figured, when I didn't pick up, that I'd ended up exactly where I belonged. She sat across from me at the kitchen table. The same one I'd done homework on, shelled peas on, cried on after my first real heartbreak. And told me what my grandparents had quietly been building for nearly 3 years. One folder, then another, my grandmother's ledgers in her own looping hand, documenting every cent my father had ever borrowed and never returned. Notes on the times he'd called them stubborn old fools, within earshot of the marina staff. A photocopy of a $190,000 loan, co-signed by my grandfather 6 years earlier, that my father had never repaid, and had carefully kept off his own company's books. Then Marguerite opened her laptop and showed me the footage from the security camera my grandfather had installed in the front hall 2 winters ago. For the raccoons. He joked at the time. 3 days after the funeral, my parents had let themselves into the house with a spare key they weren't supposed to have. On the recording, my mother walked straight to the cedar chest in the den, lifted the false bottom my grandmother had built into it herself, and opened a small fireproof box hidden beneath. She took my grandmother's sapphire ring, a strand of freshwater pearls she'd worn at her own wedding, and a gold pocket watch that had belonged to my great-grandfather, the original Ashworth who'd come over from the Maritimes with nothing. My father stood by the window the whole time, arms crossed, watching the road. My grandparents had built that house like a fortress, and then they had quietly handed me every single key. Over the next week, the people my grandparents had trusted began arriving, one by one, like they'd all been waiting for a signal. Odile, my grandmother's closest friend of nearly 50 years, who brought a second set of ledgers and enough tourtière to feed the whole concession road. Murray, who'd worked the parts counter at Ashworth Marine for 26 years, and had once overheard my father on the phone, calling my grandfather a cheap old man who needs to hurry up and die. Bram, my grandfather's longtime business partner, who laid the financial records out across the kitchen table, with a quiet, controlled fury I'd never seen on him before. And Justice Adeyemi Park, a retired judge who'd grown up 2 farms down from my grandparents, and who arrived in a wool coat and said simply, "Walter called in every favor I owed him, decades worth. Let me settle it." When my father, my mother, and Thatcher pulled up the next morning, expecting to find me alone and folding under pressure, they found that kitchen table full instead. A retired judge. A man who'd spent 26 years keeping my grandfather's boats running. A business partner with every receipt laid out in devastating, alphabetized order. My father tried his usual routine. Pointed at me, called it a facatured ambush. Used the word circus twice. Marguerite let him finish completely. Then she turned the laptop around. They watched themselves on the screen. My mother went very, very still, the color draining straight out of her face. Bram slid the loan documents across the table without a word. The kitchen went quiet. The specific, settled quiet of a room where everyone already knows exactly how the argument ends. I looked at my father, really looked at him, maybe for the first time in my life. Not the man I'd spent 26 years trying to win over, but a frightened, grasping person who had never once stopped to ask what he was turning into. "You didn't come here to protect me," I said. "You came because you were scared I'd become someone you couldn't manage. You spent my whole life making me feel like the spare part in this family. But the 2 people who actually watched all of us for 50 years, without an agenda, they chose me. I don't think you'll ever say it out loud, but that has to mean something." My father didn't have an answer for that. My mother was crying, and for the first time in my life, it might have been real. They left. The door shut. The kitchen exhaled. The months after that were full in a way I hadn't expected. Marguerite walked me through probate with more patience than I deserved on my worst days. Bram taught me the marine business start to finish. Not so I'd run day-to-day operations, because he already did that better than anyone could, but because my grandfather had always believed a leader who didn't understand the work couldn't possibly respect the people doing it. I learned what it cost a mechanic to work a Saturday in February, with his hands half frozen. I learned why my grandfather kept a coffee pot going in the shop year-round, and never once locked his office door, tucked in a folder marked Missy. I found something my grandparents had been quietly drafting for 2 years. The outline of a foundation, unpretentious and specific. The Walter and Noreen Ashworth Trades Fund. Apprenticeship grants for kids from small towns along the river who wanted to become electricians, mechanics, welders, People who built things with their hands and never got the same scholarship attention as university kids. School supply funds for the 2 elementary schools nearest the island. A program covering culinary school tuition for kids who couldn't otherwise afford it, because, as my grandmother had written in the margin in pencil, someone should have done this for June. I put $4 million into it in the first year. I kept the bakery. I want to be clear about that part, because it matters to me more than almost anything else in this story. I found a new space on the mainland, closer to the ferry dock, and I still get up at 4 in the morning most days to proof dough with my own 2 hands. My money changed what I could offer the kids who come in after school. Free hot chocolate, a warm corner, sometimes a hot meal if I notice a kid's been picking at the same muffin for 40 minutes, pretending not to be hungry. But it didn't change why I show up. I live in my grandparents' house, now, on the island, the ferry schedule built permanently into the back of my head. It still smells like cedar smoke and coffee. The rhubarb still comes back every June without anyone asking it to. My grandfather's tools still hang on that pegboard, outlined in marker, exactly where he left them. I haven't moved one. On Sundays the table is full again. Odile, Murray and his wife. Bram. Marguerite, who has somehow become something like family, the closest thing I have left to an aunt. A few of my regulars from the bakery, who never had anywhere better to be. It's loud and a little chaotic and nothing like the dinners I grew up with. Nobody is performing for anybody. Nobody is keeping score. We argue about the Leafs and eat too much and laugh at things that probably aren't even that funny. This is what my grandparents actually left me. Not $26 million. They left me proof that a life built on decency comes back around eventually. In its own time, in its own shape. Every fair deal my grandfather ever made, every employee he treated like a person and not a line item, every neighbor he helped without being asked twice. None of it came back to him directly. He never needed it to. It came back to me instead, in the form of a kitchen table, full of people who loved him enough to stand up and say so when it actually cost them something. They taught me that real wealth was never about what you hold on to. It's about what you hand off. It's the kid in culinary school, who doesn't have to choose between rent and tuition. It's the apprentice electrician from a town of 800 people who gets a shot. Nobody else offered him. It's Sunday dinners, where nobody has to earn a seat at the table. If you've ever felt like the background character in your own family, if you know what it is to grow up surrounded by people who made you feel like an inconvenience instead of a person, I want you to hear this. The people who actually see you are out there somewhere. Sometimes they're not who you'd expect. Sometimes they're the ones everybody else stopped paying attention to a long time ago. And sometimes the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally show you, very clearly, exactly who they really are. And the bravest thing you can do is believe them the first time. Stop auditioning for people who already made up their minds about you years ago. Go find your Sunday table instead.